Gospel of John, the sisters Mary and Martha learn the hardest lesson, that Jesus will come, but not necessarily when expected. It's the lesson that no one really wants to learn, and especially not in the midst of the brutal realities that we must face. In the 11th chapter of John's Gospel, it opens with the acknowledgement that Lazarus of Bethany is sick. Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha seem to have been among Jesus' closest friends. So when Lazarus falls ill, the sisters reach out to Jesus with a message: "Lord, he whom you love is ill." Lazarus is facing death, and yet Jesus, paradoxically, says that this illness will not lead to death, but it is for the glory of God. Any reader of the gospel can see illness and death are the brutal reality here, but they are not the story. Given the brutal reality that we are now facing, a priest friend of mine drew my attention this week to something called the Stockdale Paradox. It's a concept that comes from the book Good to Great by Jim Collins. He named the idea after Admiral James Stockdale, who spent 7 years as a prisoner of war in what came to be known as the Hanoi Hilton. It was anything but. During those 7 years, Stockdale was imprisoned and tortured. They were fed little, kept in close quarters in unclean conditions, and allowed little time for exercise outside. Those prisoners dreamed of rescue and a return home, but from inside a dark cell, that seemed a distant wish. When his ordeal was over, Admiral Stockdale explained something about survival. He said, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be." Jim Collins describes interviewing Stockdale about this perspective. He asked him about those who didn't make it out as well as he had. Stockdale replied, "I can tell you who didn't make it out. It was the optimists. They were the ones who always said, 'We're going to be home by Christmas.' Christmas would come and it would go, and there'd be another Christmas. And they died of a broken heart." This is the Stockdale Paradox, that to survive, we must hope and work for the best, and acknowledge and prepare for the worst. It was just before Christmas 1972 when my own father arrived at the Hanoi Hilton as a prisoner. I grew up the grateful daughter of a survivor, often hearing stories of his trauma in Vietnam, stories that would echo through the years. So I know that in my father's experience, it wasn't Christmas but Easter that they were really looking forward to. That was because at the end of January 1973, the treaty was announced, and the prisoners were told that they would be going home. It would take some time to evacuate them all, and the first to arrive would be the first to leave, and the last in would be the last out. That would put my father in the last group, which they were told would leave Vietnam within 60 days of January 29th. They quickly did the math. Freedom would come by March 29th. And then they wanted to know, does that mean we'll be home for Easter? They had no way of telling because they didn't know the date of Easter. The navigators, like my father, who had been trained in celestial navigation, tried to figure it out, because when you don't have Google to tell you when Easter will fall, you have to figure it out based on the lunar calendar. The date of Easter moves every year. It is the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. It's a complicated formula that results in the date of Easter falling sometime between March 22nd and April 25th in any given year. The navigators did their best to come up with an estimate based on the information available to them. They started dreaming of Easter at home with their families, surrounded by friends and loved ones in the familiar pews of their home church. And the spiritually hungry among them began to talk about how they could observe Lent as a season of preparation for their joyous return home. They got creative about what they could give up for Lent and what disciplines they might take on. Then God sent them a gift in the form of a book of common prayer. One of Dad's cellmates was an Episcopalian, and his family had sent him this book of common prayer. Lucky for them, the guards allowed them to keep it. Dad grabbed that book up as soon as it arrived because he realized that the answer to the question that they had been asking would be found in the back, where there is a table for finding the date of Easter. In 1973, Easter would fall on April 22nd. They would make it home in time to celebrate. And now they had the tool that they needed to observe Lent. With only the meager bread that they were given for breakfast each day, they couldn't have communion. There was no priest to bless it. But they could do morning prayer. Sunday was a day off for the guards, and so the prisoners were not usually let out of their cells at all on that day. But as long as they were worshiping, they were given permission to congregate. Their morning prayer services became exceptionally long. This is how the prisoners made it. They took every opportunity to exercise. They encouraged and gave one another comfort, and they prayed. They survived those months by accepting the reality of their prison while holding on to their faith in the future. I don't know how this current pandemic will eventually compare to the tragic histories of the past, but I do know that we find ourselves with a need to face some brutal facts. The COVID-19 virus is a highly contagious disease that is threatening the lives of many. At this time, there is neither a cure nor immunity. Our best hope is to flatten the curve of this pandemic by keeping to ourselves and staying at home. This will require sacrifice, and there will be economic consequences that we will have to live through. These are the bars of our current prison, and it does us no good to pretend that they aren't there. To act as if it doesn't matter is to put ourselves and others in harm's way. Illness, loss, and death are the brutal reality, but they are not the story. Our gospel assures us that Jesus will come. Indeed, that Jesus is already here, even in ways that we do not expect and aren't even looking for. As our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, reminded us a couple of weeks ago, God's love is contagious, and it spreads life with every act of human kindness and generosity and encouragement. There's the real story. The truth is, we don't know when Easter will be this year. Calendars are kind of meaningless at this point. We'll celebrate it from our homes on April 12th, but the real date of Easter 2020 is written in the heavens. It will be whenever Jesus comes and, calling us each by name, beckons us to come out. Until then, I pray that you will stay safe